First of all, thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm very sorry we are not meeting in person. Personally, I had in excess of this Zoom over the past 2 years. I don't want to do it ever again. In principle, it's just a very exceptional occasion that I somehow, yes, I'm very honored to do this in the absence of the general LAC meeting, to do at least something that the LAC crowd stays together. And my topic is, well, the virus. And I'll start with this talk, virus and psychoanalysis. Now, what, if anything, is a virus? What kind of ontological entity is it? If it's appropriate to speak about ontology at all. Or rather, what kind of almost non-entity, on the verge between entity and non-entity? It's not to be perceived, not without some sophisticated scientific equipment. It's too trivial to be considered by ontology. Yet this almost nothing has the power to bring to hold entire cities, countries, continents, ravage people's lives, jeopardize the economy, produce millions of victims, derail the world. And one is tempted to ask the sort of Leibnizian question, why is there a virus rather than nothing? Or maybe a virus is a kind of sinister indication that there would rather be nothing. Now, my reflections here don't directly address the pandemic crisis. They take the present virus as a cue, as an entry point, to consider the much larger question of their viral powers, the genealogy and the implications, the way they have figured in our tradition, and being tacitly present in our concepts. Now, with such an approach, it's impossible to establish a clear dividing line between the real and the metaphorical, or rather, there is a real in the metaphoricity itself. Of course, the virus is very real, and as such, it has the capacity not only to metaphorically spread in all directions, but also to evoke a certain moment of the real in the tradition of thought, a viral moment that's at the core of some key conceptual endeavors and has to engage psychoanalysis. So what I'm interested in are some incipient moves of something that could be called a viral ontology. Now, the term virus stems from Latin, where it just means poison. And the word made its way into a number of languages. Latin words were frequently imported and exported. And in all these cases, it just meant poison. But the first English use is documented around the year 1400. Then in 1728, after the word has been around for some centuries, we have the first use of virus, not merely in the sense of poison, but as an agent of causing infectious diseases. And the diseases in question were what else but venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases. So there is something like a secret phantasmatic connection between virus and Venus, a peculiar mix of poison, sex, enjoyment, and infection. And by sheer coincidence, the first documented mention of the word materialism in the sense of a philosophical current as a distinct worldview appeared in 1726 at exactly the same moment in Johann Georg Walch's Philosophisches Lexikon, which had then many reprints. And the word materialism, the moment it was born, would quickly spread and proliferate, and indeed it became instantly viral and deeply moral 18th century. So virus and materialism both oddly coincide in the high day of the age of the Enlightenment. Maybe they should be treated together as twin concepts, a sort of conceptual pair, invention of the Enlightenment. And perhaps one could take this coincidence as not a bad way to mark materialism plus virus as harbingers of modernity. And to be sure, materialism was soon to be promoted to a major philosophical stance, the touchstone of modern era of the progress of science. But there was a viral moment, this minuscule excess and counterpart that kept persisting and haunting the march of modern progress. And if I continue for a bit in this textbook manner, in the second half of the 19th century, Pasteur and Koch and some others discovered the microorganisms as the cause of disease, bacteria, something that could be seen through a microscope. And this was one of the greatest moments of success and glory of the progress of science. Yet Pasteur suspected there must be an infectious agent which is much, much smaller, invisible to microscopic eyes, elusive in its submicroscopic tininess. The virus, such as known today, was first discovered, described, and isolated by Dmitry Yosifovich Ivanovsky, a Russian botanist, who was sent to, well, Ukraine and Crimea, of all places. So the first known virus, actually ominously, was precisely from the area of the present war. And he was sent there to investigate a mysterious disease that was ruining tobacco plantations. And in 1892, he published a paper marking the discovery of the first virus, which was to become known as the tobacco mosaic virus, TMV, the founding father of all viruses. Mosaic, because it produced mosaic patterns on tobacco leaves, which are kind of lovely but fatal. Thus, the first known virus was assaulting tobacco. The virus poison was ruining this other poison. This was actually trying to protect our health, shielding us from this addictive, poisonous enjoyment and its spread. So first, virus and sex, now virus and tobacco. And while Ivanovsky described the first virus, he didn't yet give it that name. The discovery couldn't be complete without the name, namely virus, which was accomplished by a Dutch microbiologist, Martinus Beyring, in 1898, inaugurating the 20th century, a century that was to be fraught with so many viruses. Couldn't quite begin without this word. And speaking of historic coincidences, here is another one. The invention of the term virus in its current usage coincided almost exactly with Freud's publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, another viral book of the century. And this is another theme to ponder on. After virus and materialism, now virus and psychoanalysis. Another coincidence which marks another significant turn of modernity. Whilst the virus could be scientifically pinned down and described, psychoanalysis took the elusive part of the virus for its proper object. How could one propose to conceive psychoanalysis as a theory of the viral in the matter and in the spirit? We'll come to this. Sorry, just the sun is getting in my eyes. Now, if I pursue this biological thread a bit further, at a very basic level, I have no proper expertise on that. Virus is like the lowest form of life, and strictly speaking, not even life, for it doesn't possess the capacity of self-replication on its own. It is not even a cell, it's just genetic material. It's DNA, RNA, enveloped in a protein wrap, which has to find a host, a proper cell, in order to be able to replicate at all. Viruses get hold of cells and force them to reproduce their genetic material in vast quantities, thereby exploding and annihilating their hosts while outsourcing their reproduction. They're like replicating machines, parasites that need a victim for their own replication, a host to then be discarded. In themselves, they are not really alive. They cannot self-replicate, which is the crucial requirement of life. The usual parasites feed on their hosts while they take care of reproduction themselves. Viruses don't feed, but they're not really alive, and they delegate reproduction. They don't need food, and they, well, outsource sex, if this can indeed be called sex. So viruses are like the refuse of life, its side products, fragments of life, rubble, leftovers, vestiges, scraps, the flotsam and jetsam of life. But flotsam and jetsam, that is not a remainder of something else, but coextensive with life itself. Biologists don't quite agree on their origin. One theory maintains that viruses are atrophied, emaciated cells. They were once cells, but then degraded to this primitive form, taking advantage of the parasitic habitus, sparing the effort. The other, more intriguing and more widespread theory maintains that they are co-originary with cells, that they emerge together with cells in a process of co-evolution. They evolved as the counterpart of cells, the supplement, not a yin-yang supplement, but the waste of life, its reduced, mechanical, minimalistic, parasitic anti-image, but coterminous with life, not residue of something prior or exterior. They are the generate surplus of life, its trash and scum, but there is no life without them. Viruses coexist with life wherever it occurs. So here is an elementary point of philosophical interest. There is no life without this element that durates life, but has no consistency in itself, and is itself not really alive. There is, like ontologically, at a minimum, life plus that something, or almost nothing, which disrupts life and threatens with its ruin. No life without a dwelling, contaminating, minuscule surplus based on replication and repetition. So life is always this life plus this something. One could say life in the age of mechanical reproduction, but this age has always already started. And given that the virus appears like a repetitive, replicating machine grafted upon life, one cannot quite resist a very crude parallel with the way that Freud described death drive. It is ironically in line with Freud's own ambition to base both life and death drives on the biological foundation, the properties of microorganisms, of protozoa. So the growth, expansion, and proliferation of life versus the deadly mechanical, repetitive counterpart in sublife. The deadly proliferating surplus of life. And of course, Freud's contention is spurious, but also indicative of the impossibility to quite hold apart the biological, like fact, and speculation. Of course, death drive is not biological, but it pertains to biology. As already mentioned, the term virus, in the sense of an ancient agent of infection, emerged at the same time as the term materialism, in the sense of a philosophical stance, in the high day of the Enlightenment in 1726, 1728. The introduction of the term materialism produced the effect that, in retrospect, it seems as if it has always been there, ever since the ancient times, starting with the atomists Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, etc., and that the history of philosophy could be retroactively conceived as a perpetual antagonism between the two camps of idealism and materialism. Walch, as the author of the lexicon, should have shown objectivity and impartiality, or at least a semblance of them, in treating all philosophical currents with an equal eye. But he couldn't quite disguise his indignation and outrage at materialism. Matter, promoted by materialism, immediately appears as something threatening, dangerous, on the one hand due to its merely mechanical nature, and on the other hand due to being potentially infectious, contagious, virulent. So that materialism, swearing only by matter and the body, knows no transcendence, no morals, no free will, no immortal soul, no elevation of the human spirit, so it just promotes the mechanical instead of the spiritual. This was Walch's stance. And there is a confluence of two strands in this anxiety. On the one hand, the immediate concern was with the mechanical materialism, which gained currency at the time, and the la maîtrise, man, machine, etc. And on the other hand, there was a much older distrust and resistance in relation to the body and its spurious enjoyment, going back to the very origins of philosophy. And when has this started, this coupling of the spiritual with purification, cleansing the filth of the body? Thus, materialism is a current that was defined as an enemy from the outset, with the implicit assumption that matter has to be contained and spirit is what should confine, enclose, hold in check the contagion by matter and the body. This is based on a long-standing philosophical fantasy, which in simplified form implies that matter is like a disease, infectious, threatening to spread if left unchecked. And in this fantasy, spirit then appears as an immunological problem. It plays the role of the vaccine or quarantine, the disinfectant, the prohibition of close contact to counteract this contagion. There is a sort of quasi-biopolitical agenda underpinning the notions of matter and spirit. So materialism was never just an epistemological problem of knowledge and cognition, merely a philosophical view that matter is the sole substance. It always entailed an affective attitude and anguish produced by the potential contagiousness of matter and body, their filth, their viral nature, and references to spirit always relied on calls for purification. And I can just, in the footnote, reference Vladimir Yankelevich. I don't know if you know who he is, Le Pur and Impur, the pure and the impure, 1960, who persuasively argued that in an era of historical example, the spirit is inherently based on the primal anxiety of infection and pollution, which threaten with expropriation and disintegration. The spirit has always functioned as a shield against the impure, thus coupled with decontamination, disinfection. So the metaphysics of purity may be a redundant expression, and this also extends to the term catharsis, based on pure, katharin, to cleanse. And Yankelevich draws ramified philosophical implications from that. And of course, there is Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger from 1966, a few years later, who made a great anthropological case, this kind of anthropological counterpart to Yankelevich. So one could propose the odd couple of epistemology versus epidemiology. The virus in this sense would then figure as matter in its extreme and reduced form, its refuse, and therefore matter brought to the gist, matter at its minimum, the invisible matter being more matter than the visible one. The virus would thus be like the atom, the real atom of matter, the minimal particle, the effective sort of biopolitical counterpart to the atoms of physics. Virus stands for this impalpable, invisible part that makes that matter is matter. In this view, virus doesn't even have the status of a proper entity. It evokes a pure capacity of infection and infinite replication, mechanical repetition. Thus, virus could be conceived as the truth of the matter. And when we can never quite say we are materialists, of course we are materialists, we moderns, we are not concerned with transcendence, the beyond, the sacred, the soul, the spiritual elevation. We can't say it because of this viral sting that always inhabits matter, a sting which inspires anxiety, unease, disgust, but also at the same time as the reverse side, enjoyment and its success. It affects us in ways other than cognitive ones. Virus is like the surplus of the matter, of live matter, standing at the place of its dysfunction. So it comes as a positive expression of a certain inner dysfunction of the matter and of life. So this is the prevailing, if simplified, traditional representation. Matter and body as potential viral disease and spirit as the cure. And one could tentatively maintain that every philosophy is in some aspect the philosophy of the virus. That the virus is always underpinned by an ontological background, a supposition, assumption. Tell me what you think of the virus, and they'll tell you what philosophy is subscribed to. Yet, this idea, or rather this fundamental fantasy underpinning so much of the philosophical tradition, this idea which stretches back to the origins of philosophy and further beyond, perhaps to the very origins of civilization, this idea took a new turn and acquired a different form in the age of the Enlightenment, with the proper invention of materialism, the designation of materialist program. functioning as the philosophical background of the progress of science. Materialism, in this new sense, isolated matter and promoted it to the rank of the sole substance, which is the master word of philosophy, thereby paradoxically disinfecting it, as it were. The mechanical materialism, which was the big discussion of the time, endeavored to reduce matter to mechanism, free of the filth and defectious agents, and turn it into a mere mechanism. So one fantasy, virus as the gist of the matter, was like countered by another, the conception of matter as devoid of the virus, a merely mechanical matter, reducible to laws and formulas, to mathemes. Virus can then be seen as its counterpart, an object emerging at the same time as it's left over a modern object par excellence, a disruptive surplus, an irreducible almost nothing. So we have this couple of, on the one hand, matrices universalis, and on the other hand, the virus, a very odd couple. And to be sure, the early mechanical materialism was then superseded by far more complex models. There was the organic materialism extending to microorganisms and eventually being able to discover and counteract the virus itself. Nevertheless, the irreducible viral remainder persisted. It couldn't be quite removed by the successful march of science, appearing rather as its excess counterpart. First, the coincidence of the simultaneous emergence of virus and materialism, then the coincidence of the simultaneous scientific description of the virus and the advent of psychoanalysis. So, could one conceive of psychoanalysis as the science of this virus, this excess, this remainder? Not just materialism, but the materialism of matter plus, body plus, matter plus this viral surplus. Okay. Let's have a look now at two grand examples of philosophical tradition, to Plato and Hegel. What do Plato and Hegel have to say about the virus? Even if they obviously don't use the term. Virus largely stands for the capacity of infection and contamination. And let's keep just with these two giants, the twin peaks of philosophy. Now, Plato entirely pertains to the traditional constellation of the matter-body versus spirit ideas, to the point of marking its paradigm. And now consider the way Plato treats the problem of mimesis, or what one could call his panic fear of mimesis. And to make it quick, in the ideal community of Plato's Republic, art is immediately taken to be a political issue, a source of possible contagion. Of course, now we cannot properly deal with this in this scope, nor with the larger problem of mimesis and its function of art. So very briefly, and here I'm just briefly summarizing the paper I published some years ago in Critical Inquiry. In theater, to take just this example, actors mimetically impersonate various personalities. They assume someone else's voice and posture, their behavior and appearance. They imitate them. And this is what defines acting. But this imitation entails consequences. The problem is that it always leaves a mark. One cannot imitate innocently without being stained by what one imitates, without being infected. And the question arises whether or not we'll allow tragedy and comedy into our city, whether our guardians should be imitators or not. And here's a quote from Plato, Republic 3. They mustn't be clever at doing or imitating slavish or shameful actions, lest from enjoying the imitation, they come to enjoy reality. Or haven't you noticed that imitations practiced from youth become part of nature and settle into habits of gesture, voice, and thought? Then we won't allow them to imitate either a young woman or an older one, or one abusing her husband, quarreling with the gods, or bragging because she thinks herself happy. or one suffering misfortune and possessed by sorrows and limitations, but even less one who is ill in love or in labor. Okay, end of quote. So they should by no means imitate women, and I love this sequence, ill in love or in labor. And they shouldn't imitate slaves or bad men, perverts, cowards, drunkards, madmen. And furthermore, this is where the thing gets really hilarious. Just in case, they should also refrain from imitating, I quote, neighing horses, bellowing bulls, roaring rivers, the crashing sea, thunder, or anything of that sort. So, in a word, one shouldn't imitate anything lowly, from villains, women, and slaves to animality and nature, anything below the rank of a free citizen, for one is necessarily affected and infected by it, whether one wants to or not. One never knows. Imitation informs and permeates our being. So one may not be able to stop neighing, roaring, bellowing, thundering, or crying out in labor. So it catches us unawares, without our consent. There is no innocent or neutral imitation. Imitation always sticks. And theater appears as a particularly dangerous source of epidemic. We contract what we imitate. We may become what we enact, notwithstanding that acting is just a material emulation of words and behavior. But why should we fear that? Why should Plato fear that? It all seems as if the material has the power to affect the immaterial, to contaminate the realm of ideas and spirit. Touch possesses the secret power to infect the untouchable. It appears as if Plato doesn't quite believe in his own theory of ideas, but secretly believes that they can be infested and put into jeopardy by the material, by mere imitation. The material is viral, and what he secretly believes in is the power of the virus. Actors are particularly at risk since they imitate in their body and voice, but the audience, which watches the spectacle with empathy, with horror and pity, is equally exposed since models and examples attract and mold our spirit. We become what we watch. Watching is already being in touch, in contact, if at distance. Examples irresistibly call for emulation. There is this viral power that works even at distance. But where does this secret power come from? The power of the corporeal, of the imitation to infect the spiritual. And perhaps the problem ultimately lies in enjoyment as the secret mover. When imitating, something in us starts enjoying it. It just enjoys and it doesn't want to know, which is, by the way, one of Lacan's definitions of the unconscious, or rather of it. It says, ça jouit et ça ne veut rien savoir. It enjoys, it doesn't want to know. So there is an enjoyment that we cannot control and contain. It starts enjoying mimesis, and particularly imitating questionable models. It forces its way to satisfaction regardless of any other considerations. It enjoys at our expense. And this can be connected to the way that what Freud says about the drive. He speaks about the Klebrigkeit, the stickiness of the drive, that its aptitude to stick, to be fixed at the point where it got satisfaction and only wants to come back to the scene of the crime. It's the capacity of the drive to form the glue. So one cannot quite oppose and fight its enjoyment by better knowledge, by cognition, epistemologically. The episteme seems to be powerless in face of it. Enjoyment in the material is like a virus that cannot be contained by logos. Logos cannot quite stop this epidemic danger. And here's another minimal conceptual pair. Logos versus virus. So what is to be done? Well, the problem is that we humans, of course I'm simplifying this Plato's argument, maybe making a caricature of it. The problem is that we humans are creatures of mimesis. Everything human we learn by imitation, and language to start with, which is after all the basis of logos. We learn to speak by imitating, first without understanding. So what Plato proposes is not just advancing virtue and promoting knowledge, but rather mimesis as a weapon against mimesis. He proposes to fight bad mimetic models with good ones. One should by all means imitate good examples. I quote, "the courageous, self-controlled, pious, and free man." One should be edified and elevated by noble models. So imitation can cut both ways. But there is an admission in this. If we can't beat it, we should join forces with it. If one cannot resist the powers of mimesis, then let's hope that good examples are more contagious than the bad ones. The material imitation of virtue will hopefully contaminate us with virtue. One needs at some point the viral capacity of models and imitation in order to install true knowledge and virtue. Thus, virtue also has to rely on the virus. In some part, we have to contract it, acquire it by imitation, not just by knowledge. One should contest one viral infection with another. But then, what is virtue? What is knowledge? If it has to rely on imitation and infection, if it is dependent on this virus? Do vice and virtue, in regard to mimesis, effectively share the same viral mechanism, counting on the infectious nature of imitation and ultimately on enjoyment? And so much for Plato, very briefly and very schematically. While Plato ascribes viral powers to material imitation and is thus in line with the traditional view of the infectious nature of matter and body, Hegel addresses the viral powers of spirit itself. He directly states that spirit can and must itself be seen as infectious. When in the phenomenology of spirit, he discusses the Enlightenment, and which is the movement that invented both materialism and the virus, he considers the power of its ideas, and most prominently the idea of reason, pitted against the powers of prejudice, superstition, idols, fetishes, social rank, unfounded habits and beliefs, all the panoply that supported the old order, the Ancien Régime. How do these enlightened ideas spread? How did they turn into this overpowering force that eventually actually led to nothing less than the French Revolution? And this is the chapter where Hegel deals with the developments that led to this great historic moment of the French Revolution, the event that inspired huge enthusiasm in his youth. Well, Hegel's answer is, they spread like an infection, eine Ansteckung, literally, a pervasive infection, eine durchdringende Ansteckung. And any fight against this infection is futile. It is now the spirit that infects the bodies. And here is a quote from Hegel, from the Phenomenology. The struggle is too late, and every remedy adopted only aggravates the disease, for it has laid hold of its pure essence itself, Therefore, too, there is no power within it which could overcome the disease. Rather, being now an invisible and undetected spirit, it infiltrates the nobler parts through and through, and soon has taken complete possession of all the vitals and members of the unconscious idol. Then, one fine morning, it gives its comrade a show with an elbow, and bang, crash, the idol lies on the floor. End of quote. Bang, crash, in German, it's Bautzbaradauts. If you need a quote from Hegel, a good quote from Hegel, here it is, Bautzbaradauts. Now, how did this happen, this transformation, this spectacular downfall of the idols, this collapse of the belief in all kinds of idols that used to be the pillars of the old world for so long, upholding the power of tradition? Here, it's not materiality in the body that contaminates the spirit. It's not the spirit that would have to erect ramparts against them. Here we have the spirit itself spreading like an infectious disease, permeating all pores of this world through what Hegel calls the silent, ceaseless weaving of the spirit, das stumme Fortweben des Geistes. Das stumme Fortweben des Geistes, tacitly doing its work. So it's stumm, which means mute, dumb, until one day the idol lies on the ground, a victim of this mute progress of reason. So it's not like wir weben, as in Heine's famous line, if you know the poem, nor is it simply der Geist webt, like the spirit weaves, but we could paraphrase this as es webt, it weaves, es webt in Geiste, it weaves in the spirit. And this could be put in line with Lacan's notorious formulas of the unconscious. Ça parle, it speaks. Ça jouit, it enjoys. And propose, ça tisse, it weaves, it weaves. So the progress of reason is viral and silent, depending on an it that weaves, doing its work beyond our intentions. And this is a silent virus, not the voice of reason, which has ample history from Rousseau and Kant to Freud. But the silent reason, more than that, it's stumm, it's dumb and mute, a wordless spirit, a wordless reason, but like a wordless logos, which looks like a contradiction in terms, since logos is the word. It is like the pure viral force of logos, shall we say dumb logos, the zero level of logos. Now, Hegel couldn't resist quoting Diderot, specifically Rameau's nephew. It's from Diderot that he borrowed this fall of the idols, foretelling nothing less than the French Revolution. And this is one of the very few direct quotes in the whole of phenomenology. Now, Diderot, the arch-enlightener, the head of the encyclopedia, the spiritual basis at the heart of the Enlightenment. Diderot was the one who truly believed in the victory of reason, which can rely only on the infectious power of truth, goodness, and beauty. He believed that these powers would spread like contagion, unstoppably do away with all the idols, and ultimately triumph by becoming pandemic. The virus of truth, goodness, and beauty is supposedly irresistible. And here is the original passage from Diderot, the passage on which this previous Hegel's quote is based. I quote, "The rights of the true, the good, and the beautiful will always prevail. They may be contested, but in the long run, they are admired. Art lacking in these qualities may be admired for a time, but eventually the applause gives way to yawns. So yawn away, my friends, yawn to your heart's content. Don't be embarrassed. The supremacy of nature and of my Trinity is such that the forces of hell can never prevail against it. Truth, which is the Father, engendering good, which is the Son, whence comes beauty, which is the Holy Spirit. My Trinity establishes its dominion imperceptibly. The foreign God humbly takes his place upon the altar at the side of the indigenous idol. Little by little, he consolidates his position until one fine day, he gives his neighbor a gentle shove, and lo and behold, the idol falls. Patatra is what the word that Diderot uses. I continue, the political system that makes straight for its target without commotion or bloodshed or martyrs, without hurting a hair of anybody's head, strikes me as the best. End of quote. So here we have sort of another conceptual pair, like virus and utopia. Diderot is the harbinger of the proper viral utopia. The virus will prevail over the old order and do away with idols with a bang by its sheer epidemic powers, by the infectiousness of the true, the good, and the beautiful. It will proceed silently and invisibly until the old order is crushed without even putting up a fight, not quite aware of what hit it. One cannot resist the virus of reason. If spirit is like a vaccine against the body, and there is no vaccine against the spirit itself, the idea of reason. This is Diderot's background. Now one, wishes one could share Diderot's optimism, his viral utopia. But 200 years on, we can't. But not even Hegel, writing a quarter of a century after Diderot's death, could share it. To be sure, he maintained that we need the spiritual infection. The silent weaving has to do its work, the process that doesn't quite depend on our will and intent. It has to do it. But this is not enough. What is needed is also the reverse of this weaving. We need what Hegel calls, and what follows our previous quote, the action of the negative essence, which has to take upon itself the sheer uproar and violent struggle with the opposite. And in German it's ein lauter Lärm and gewaltsamer Kampf. Und gewaltsamer Kampf. So a loud noise as opposed to muteness. We cannot merely rely on the viral powers of spirit, supposedly triumphant in the long run, without any struggle and bloodshed. We cannot wait for it to do its work. We have to turn ourselves into the warriors of this virus. So one aspect of spirit is silent, mute, peaceful-like. The other aspect is loud, noisy, and violent. And there is a maximum opposition within the spirit itself. It is silent. We have to be loud. So virus is ambiguous in itself. It's a poison or a cure, a poison and a cure in one, a sort of pharmacon. It is only when we turn into the agents of the virus that it can display the nature of its viral powers. It's only by constructing a universality on its basis that it can reveal its efficacy. What it silently effects can only be decided retroactively by our own engagement and risk. And now a sort of digression. This is the logic that Marx implicitly adopted in his own way in the famous passage of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte in 1852, when dealing with the progress of revolution. A quote from Marx now. But the revolution is thoroughgoing. It is still traveling through purgatory. It does its work methodically. It had completed half of its preparatory work. Now it is completing the other half. And when it has accomplished the second half of preparatory work, Europe will leap from its seat and exclaim, "Well burrowed, old mole." Okay, end of quote. This is, of course, a paraphrase of Hamlet's "Well said, old mole," which introduces another image, that of the mole, the silent underground weaver of tunnels, quietly toiling away until suddenly everything collapses. Although Marx doesn't speak about the spread of spirit, nor about the virus, but about the preparatory subterranean work being done imperceptibly, the connection is clearly there. The infectious, imperceptible diffusion of the idea of reason, borrowed from Diderot, eventually led to the French Revolution, and the revolution that Marx is envisaging, its extension, has to rely on a similar infection, the silent underground weaving transformed material conditions. Marx actually used the same phrase that was proposed by Hegel at the very end of his History of Philosophy. And this is where Marx probably got the idea. A quote from Hegel: "Spirit often seems to have forgotten and lost itself, but inwardly opposed to itself, it is inwardly working ever forward. As when Hamlet says of the ghost of his father, 'Well done, worthy mole.' Until grown strong in itself, it bursts asunder the crust of earth which separated it from its concept, so that the earth crumbles away." Okay. In both these passages, the viral work is transposed to the mole, and the silent weaving to underground digging. And shall we say, there's a connection between the virus and the mole. The virus, you see, there is always this virus spread of metaphors. And Hegel spoke of the stumme fortweben, the mute dumb weaving. One should add that the mole is blind to complete the image. The mute blind agent of spirit needs to do the subterranean work before it can be assumed by a conscious will and decision. It takes a mole virus for spirit to come forth, depending not simply either on the development of material conditions or on the force of ideas, but propelled by a viral sting at the bottom of both. Okay, I'm coming to my last part, the conclusion. What, if anything, is the virus? These are merely the beginnings, the tentative first steps of something one could call a viral ontology. On the one hand, the virus is an alien body, threatening from outside, endangering our lives, endangering our biological, social, economic, political habitus. But on the other hand, virus can also be the name of something that inhabits our most intimate interior. One can say that this is the metaphorical counterpart to the external virus. But can one qualify it simply by metaphoricity? It's a bit of the real that can be designated by the viral metaphor, but ultimately cannot be quite exhausted by it. It manifests itself for one part as the gist of the bodily, of the material, enjoyment, spreading by touch, contamination, and we are always stuck with our infectious, frail, material bodies. But the spirit, on the other hand, cannot but rely on its own viral nature either, reproducing itself, growing while spreading, infecting our bodies. And perhaps one could look at it from the opposite angle, namely that our bodies are not spurious by themselves, by being mere bodies, and thus limited in their finite carnality. The body becomes troublesome because it is infected by the spirit, parasitized by the spiritual virus, the bearer of spiritual infection, hence pertaining to culture, to the very divide nature culture, or to the incidence of the symbolic. The body is then always the body plus, irreducible to its physiology, just as in a broader sense, matter is always matter plus, and one should add spirit plus. Be it body, matter, or spirit, they're both inhabited by this X, this virus thing that instigates and propels contamination and proliferation. Perhaps what body and spirit ultimately have in common is this strange viral non-entity which drives both at the core. But this is where we stumble upon the limit of metaphoricity. With the virus as the microorganism, what has to do with the deadly excess or surplus of life itself, its dwelling refuse inscribed in life as its rubble. The viral capacity of matter and spirit is what comes into the place of negativity inscribed into being infested by the symbolic, the product of the negative cut, that in being which is not quite being. But where does the symbolic negativity come from? How is it that it pertains to life, that it emerges in the midst of life? How is life structured so as to allow for this negativity? Maybe let's stop there before this abyss engulfs us. But there are, on the one hand, the body and matter as bearers of one kind of universality, materialism in its paradox, is matter as substance. And on the other hand, there is spirit as the bearer of traditional notion of universality, the ideas, universal concepts. But both have to have a viral germ in their bosom, that which cannot be quite universalized and works inside them. Virus as the reverse side of universality and its internal other. Should one add, spell it out, isn't this like object A? As for the perennial discussion about realism, one can propose a realism of matter, and indeed modern materialism invented by the Enlightenment and relying on the progress of modern science, promoted the idea of matter ruled by universal laws. And one can propose a realism of ideas, as it was massively done by traditional idealism from Plato to Hegel. And one can seek new ways how it can be reinvented and reinvigorated. But is there a realism of the virus, of this bit deranging universality, yet propelling it? This minuscule non-entity, undermining entities, yet pushing them to spread. This bit, which is not something in itself, not reducible to either mind or objectivity, not to be pinned down to an existing thing or idea. But there is no realism of the virus. And if the virus is but a pointer to an intractable bit of the real, and this is where the Lacanian tenets come in, one can extend this to the adage, there is no realism of the real, but this is precisely what calls for a reinvention of universality. What we call human perhaps ultimately depends on this viral knot of spirit and body, on the virus as its intimate alien kernel, its extimate kernel. And we are to fight the present massive viral danger affecting humanity at this moment. What better resources to rely on but this our viral nature itself? To combat one virus with another, a more potent virus, if we turn ourselves into its agents. To put it naively, the virus of the word, the virus of the body, the virus of spirit, the virus of idea, which all inhabit our core as the inhuman at the core of humanity. A virus is an external danger, a contingent calamity, just as the big epidemics of the past or the natural disasters. They don't have any deeper meaning, no secret message, no hand of fate, apart from the fact that our lives are vulnerable, fragile, and exposed to contingency. Contingency from contango, co-touch, says the same etymology as contamination and contact. They are all subjects to touch. But with our reaction, it immediately turns into a social category, a matter of choice and decision, a question of what kind of society we live in and what kind of society we would want. The moment it affects us, it turns into a problem of the social construction of universality. And at the same time, this is part of the same move, it engages these viruses that inhabit the core of our culture. Etymologically, pandemic stems from pandemos, which literally means all people. It is something that affects all people. Pan is a prefix which qualifies all, such as in, Pan-Slavic or Pan-Germanic, or if you remember, Pan-American, the US carrier, now extinct. Pan also as in Pantheon, the sanctuary of all gods, or as in Pandemonium, the place where all demons congregate, the devilish place, a word used by Milton in the Paradise Lost. And there seems to be but a small slide, a shortcut from pandemic to pandemonium, as opposed to Pantheon. But if pandemic affects all, is it therefore universal? Is concerning and involving all enough for universality? If anything, the pandemic demonstrated that the two not only don't coincide but stand at the opposite ends. If anything, it exposed how deeply divided we are. It exacerbated the profound antagonisms that permeate our societies, well enhanced by the decades of neoliberal policies, the class antagonism, the difference of wealth and income, the gender difference, men and women being put in very disparate situations with all the caring professions, domestic violence, the generational difference, the old put at a huge disadvantage, the precarious workers, the unemployed, the racial antagonism, the immigrants, the migrants, the refugees, the marginalized, all these antagonisms have been magnified by the pandemic, manifesting the extent of the social disease far worse than the virus itself. The virus uniting us all facing the same pandemic danger, at the very same time highlighted the withering away of the common, of the universal, the waning of the big other. This is a psychoanalytic shorthand for all this. Can one propose a politics of the virus? Of course not. The external virus has the capacity to engage these other viruses that inhabit the core of our culture, but there is no politics of the virus in any immediate sense. The virus thing cannot be taken as a direct lever. It cannot be universalized. Well, by definition, it's the non-universalizable. And any politics worthy of its name is about the construction of the universal. But universality that could reflect and engage the viral powers that stand at this core of humanity. What Hegel described as turning into the agents, the warriors of the virus. One could expect that COVID, given the pandemic threat, would mobilize the mechanisms of a new enhanced universality, collectivity, and solidarity. But it rather appeared as the catalyst of the falling apart of the common. Pandemic rather evoking pandemonium. And this is the paradox, the exacerbated paradox of our time. The more there is communication and information, the more the world is connected, the more it seems to be falling apart, the less there is capacity for the universal. And I have no magic solution, no practical formula to propose, just a reflection on the viral powers of our own tradition that should inspire trust in our human virality and give us courage. Thank you.